This is Ian Hartley.
I am Warren Kay.
And I am Sasha Steenbergen.
Welcome to the Rediscovering God Dialogue.
We invite you to join us as we endeavor to see Him more clearly
and love Him more dearly while following Him more nearly. Welcome to podcast number 153 of our Rediscovering God journey. And today we begin our journey in chapter 22 of Genesis. And I believe we'll be in this chapter for some time because this story is pivotal and foundational for many beliefs within the Christian community. And so we need to look at it very carefully and prayerfully as we work our way through this chapter. So, Sasha, why don't you start us off with verse 1?
Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied. Here I am.
So, Warren, read the King James Version, please. There's a Hebrew word here. It's nasa, N-A-S-A-H, that's used. And you'll see that most translations say tested. God tested Abraham, but the King James uses another word.
Okay, I am almost there. New King James. Well, interesting. The New King James says, "Now it came to pass after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am." So that's the New King James.
Yes.
You want the original King James?
I do. 1611 authorized version.
There it is. And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am.
So here's the takeaway from this. The King James was the standard English Bible from soon after 1611 until about 1950, I would say. I mean, that's a run of over 300 years.
Yes.
This translation influenced the way people thought about this story. And the story was told that God tempted Abraham. Now, what that means is, we'll try and define temptation a little bit more, but it gives the idea that it's okay for God to tempt people. And by association, that people who follow God will be okay for them to tempt people also. And it means that God can ask Abraham to do something that none of us would ever be prepared to do with our children. It introduces a whole concept of God. Just the change in that one word from tested to tempted. It really makes a huge difference. Mm-hmm. So we need to look at this word very carefully. So I looked it up in a New American Standard by exhaustive concordance. You know what an exhaustive concordance is, Sasha? It's one that when you've read it, you're totally exhausted.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
An exhaustive concordance is one that tries to find all the usages of the word in the Old Testament. This word is nasa, N-A-S-A-H. And they conclude, I'm going to read it to you just to exhaust you. This is their conclusion. It's used as follows. Make a test once, proved once, put to the test twice, tempted 3 times, tested 13 times, tested 9 times, testing 3 times, tried once, try once, venture once, ventures once. So I didn't add up all those usages. Perhaps one of you want to do that, but it's about 30 usages of the term, and 3 of them are tempted.
Mhm.
Yeah,
The
pretty clever.
overwhelming translation of the word is tested, or some proved, examined, something like that.
Mhm.
So I want to suggest that temptation is always linked with a possible negative outcome. I'm tempted to eat chocolate. I'm never tempted to eat Brussels sprouts or broccoli or bananas. If you get what I mean. Eating Brussels sprouts, broccoli, and bananas has no negative outcomes. Well, I suppose if you ate too many. But eating chocolate has possible negative outcomes. So we say, I was tempted to eat chocolate.
So if Irma left a chocolate bar out on the table to see whether you would eat it or not, would that be a test or a temptation?
Well, if I weighed 300 pounds, it would be definitely a temptation. But still, it might be, because I might have already consumed quite a bit of chocolate. And she's cautioned me about my chocolate intake. And I have vowed to desist.
Mhm.
So it could be. Depends on her intent.
Right.
She just forgot it there or purposefully put it there.
Okay.
Either way, I do not picture Irma tempting you or testing you with chocolate. I think she would gift you with chocolate and hope that you enjoyed it. Oh, I hear your point.
You know, you say the nicest things. Please keep talking. So, and there's another aspect here that we need to talk about, and that is that it's perfectly legitimate to test people on skill sets. I mean, I would like my physician to have passed his medical exams. Okay. And I would like the other drivers on the road to be competent drivers, which means they've been tested to see if they're competent.
Mhm.
We all recognize this is legitimate. It's when testing becomes moral with
Mhm.
possible negative outcomes that we say it's a temptation. So let's talk about Job for a minute. Was Job tested or tempted or both? What's actually going on here?
Well, fortunately, with the first 2 chapters of the book, we know that whichever it was coming from someone other than God. It was
Mm-hmm.
coming from the Shaitan.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm not sure, was he tempted or tested?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to know because he wanted to expose Job's intent for the way that he lived to try to show that he wasn't as faithful to God as people thought.
Mm. So I think that's the clue, is that the Shaitan wants a negative outcome from this testing.
True.
He wants Job to give up his faith in God because God hasn't protected him from disasters.
Mm.
Hmm.
So then Job's wife would have been tempting him as well when she
Yes.
said, curse God and die.
Yes. So it's interesting that in the Psalms, you have God tempting or testing people, and then you also have people testing God. So if we read Psalm 26, verse 2, where David is feeling quite virtuous, fine, upstanding king, he says in verse 2,
Test me, Lord, and try me. Examine my heart and my mind.
yeah, he's really encouraging God to notice how wonderful he is.
Mhm.
And then Psalm 66. Warren, if you can pick it up where the paragraph break is, before verse 10.
Let the whole world bless our God and loudly sing his praises. Our lives are in his hands, and he keeps our feet from stumbling. You have tested us, O God. You have purified us like silver. You have captured us in your net and laid the burden of slavery on our backs.
See that last little bit, you have captured us and laid the burden of slavery on our backs. Like, how would you feel about God doing that to you? And the psalmist is talking about what happened in Egypt.
Well, it's a little bit like the feeling that we have for getting born on this planet through no choice of ours. It was something that was laid on us that we didn't have any input in.
You know, you raise such an interesting point now, is that many people feel and describe this life as a type of a testing time to see whether you will be faithful to God or not. And would you ever say that to a child? I brought you into this world. I'm testing you to see if you're going to love me for the rest of my life.
No,
Why wouldn't you say that?
that wasn't the purpose of them coming. Yeah.
So this is very real, that people see their lives on this planet as a probation time. And that God is watching us with eagle eyes to see if we pass all the tests. That's actually how they negotiate life.
And I think it comes as a result of a misunderstanding that it wasn't God's intention for it to be this way, that God's original plan got sidetracked onto a side rail, and so we're dealing with this mess because of the enemy.
Yeah, yeah. It's like your child gets ill and you say to the child, well, I'm watching you to see if you're going to get better. You know, you better smarten up and get better. Here's the third Psalm reference for God testing us, Psalm 139, 23 to 24. It's a psalm with David also. We'll just read those two verses.
Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you and lead me along the path of everlasting life.
Mm-hmm. So how would you summarize what David is asking for? Sort of like when he says, create in me a clean heart, O God.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to be a loyal, authentic follower of God.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we've read three references where God is testing people or tempting them, depending upon how you interpret it. Now here are a few where people test God, and that's interesting. So Psalm 78, 18 to 19.
They stubbornly tested God in their hearts, demanding the foods they craved. They even spoke against God himself, saying, God can't give us food in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm. So Psalm 78, verse 44, 41.
Again and again they tested God's patience and provoked the Holy One of Israel.
So the New King James Version says they tempted God. Again and again they tempted God's patience and provoked the Holy One. So here's a third one with the people testing God or tempting God. Psalm 95, 8 to 9.
The Lord says, don't harden your hearts as Israel did at Meribah, as they did at Massa in the wilderness. For there your ancestors tested and tried my patience, even though they saw everything I did.
So when the Israelites test God, what are they actually saying?
Well, they're challenging God's motive. Did he bring them out there for them to die, or would he provide for them?
Yeah. So actually, when you look at it in terms of motivational reasons that they're doing this, they are actually suggesting that God had evil intent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they even say, well, you brought us out here to die in the wilderness, to Moses. You and God have brought us out in the wilderness. And then when we've all died, you're going to take all our possessions, our gold and silver, and you'll be very rich.
Mm.
I mean, that's a horrific suggestion to make to somebody. So if I was making a translation, I would move it from tested to tempted.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the evil intent that's behind it.
Yeah, and yet at the same time, what I'm feeling is that, you know, for these people who have been in slavery for 400 years, you know, their lens that they're seeing everything through is trauma.
Yeah.
And now when they're in the wilderness and they don't even have the surety of at least what they had there, I think they would, you know, they were so mistreated. They were, you know, used and all these kinds of things. This to me seems natural that they would be seeing this, this through this lens, that potentially, you know, is there even good going to be coming from here? I don't. Yeah, I just see that it's their trauma speaking, not in any way anything that they could have done differently, really. And I'm cognizant now of the fact that we are, that the writer has written this story looking back through history on this and is able to fill in, you know, what people are saying and what potential, you know, intent is there as well. Because when you were referencing the Job story, you know, when we got to the end of that one, it was interesting because I've always had a hard time with the Job story. I feel like the last time we talked about it in, you know, many podcasts ago, I was starting to get a little bit more understanding. But now I heard it in a different way, almost as if, you know, it's like this allegory of the world and we're looking far from the, you know, it's like we've gone to the future. We, you know, God is giving an impression of this whole, you know, conflict here in the world. And now we're sort of zeroing back in and trying to make it tangible in this story. And so when the word tested or tempted is, you know, being used, I think it's just effect of the causation of the fact that God really wanted freedom of choice and had to, you know, pull back in order to allow that to happen. So yeah, it's very interesting. I'm not formulating all my thoughts well, but stuff's percolating.
Well, this is a huge paradigm shift that we may need to make. So don't rush it. It takes a while to let these ideas, as you say, percolate. So the Lord's Prayer in the King James Version says, "And lead us not into temptation." Now, behind that statement, subconsciously, you conclude that sometimes God leads you into temptation and you have to ask him not to.
Mm-hmm.
So the New Living Translation says, "Don't let us be led away by temptation." So they've already made a shift here, away from the idea that we need to ask God not to lead us into temptation. Otherwise, he will.
But I think that's pivotal right there, because if we understand God as somebody who does do that, which if we, you know, even list when you listed all those terms in the concordance there, you know, that just only in my mind speaks to people's interpretation and understanding of the scriptures and understanding of the role of God in the Old Testament. But I find it very interesting that, in some places we read the Bible, verse, like each word in the verse, and we really go, wow, and we really ruminate on it and we go, wow. And then other times we read it, and even when it says, God said, da 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 da, we go, oh yeah, well, we understand now that actually this was man's understanding of what they thought the role of God was. So it's kind of like holding it all a little bit more loosely in the hands, I think, which is helpful for me.
Yeah, and in a parallel statement, it's almost impossible for us to communicate without metaphors and idioms.
Right.
If somebody says, I had butterflies in my stomach,
Yeah.
we're not talking about part of your anatomy, the stomach, and nor are we talking about insects.
Right.
What we're saying is, I was anxious.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you don't understand idioms, which I think is almost impossible, but let's suppose you did, you would be saying, wow, how'd the butterflies get into your stomach? Did you eat them?
Yeah.
I mean, it just creates nonsense to
Yeah.
interpret that literally. Okay. So that's the problem we're up against, is that the Hebrews also had idioms.
Yeah.
And so when you take a translation like the King James Version, which tries to make everything literal, you run into problems. And that's why the New International Version, the New American Standard Bible, they try and equate those Hebrew idioms with English, an English idiom that fits the intent of the Hebrew idiom.
Yeah.
Reminds me of a book I was reading to my grandson, Amelia Bedelia.
Oh, love Amelia Bedelia.
And she got a job at a restaurant, and this man was in a hurry, and he said, I want a piece of pie and step on it. And so she did just that. She brought him a piece of pie, climbed up on the counter and stepped on it, and she got fired right on the spot.
Oh, I love it. That's great. Yeah.
So we talked about this in our podcast on the Lord's Prayer and suggested that the personal pronoun was missing in the last three statements of the Lord's Prayer. You give us this day our daily bread. You forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And you lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil.
Amen.
So just make that reference there.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Now, the problem, I just want to go back to this. Let's go to another verse, Matthew 4 verse. Before I do that, when Jesus asks Philip how to procure enough food for 5,000 men, I want you to notice the reason given in John 6 verse 6. It says literally that Jesus was testing him. I don't know of any version that says Jesus was tempting him, but it's the same word, and we all recognize that Jesus had no evil intent behind his question. He was rather asking Philip, have you moved from being without faith? Do you have any faith in me yet? And Philip didn't. But there was no evil intent behind it. Jesus did not expect something bad to come out of it. He's trying to figure out if Philip is starting to think, well, Jesus is here. He can do a miracle. I've seen him do miracles. Maybe he'll make bread today. But Philip doesn't ever go there.
And very similarly, Jesus tests the disciples in the story of the Gentile woman, the Syrophoenician woman, in Mark chapter 7. And he goes along with the view that this woman, she's wanting a miracle, she's wanting help, and he talks about taking the bread from the children, and she challenges him and says, yeah, but even the dogs get the crumbs under the table. And so there seems to be a bit of a test for the disciples and for her. What is her understanding of God?
So let's go now to Matthew 4, verse 1. This is in the context of the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness. Matthew 4, verse 1.
Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil.
Thank you. Who led Jesus into the wilderness? The Spirit. And why did the Spirit take him there? To be tempted by the devil. Okay, now, unfortunately, this is the first gospel. By the time people have finished reading Matthew, they're exhausted and don't often get to Mark, Luke, and John. So have a look at, we're going to read it, Luke 4, verse 2.
He was led by the Spirit in the wilderness, where he was tempted by the devil for 40 days.
Okay, where he was tempted. Causation of why it's in the wilderness is not mentioned here. It just says the Spirit led him into the wilderness and he was tempted, or where he was tempted. And you have the same thing in Mark chapter 2. We're not going to read that one. But the damage is done because Matthew's gospel comes first.
Mm.
So Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil.
Mm-hmm.
Now we come to a pivotal verse in the letter of James. James is the half-brother of Jesus. Martin Luther said this letter to James is a letter of straw, feed it to your donkey. Because he was so focused on righteousness by faith that when James says something about works, that doesn't sit well with Martin Luther, bless his soul. So here we're reading James 1:13 to 15. And I want you to notice where temptation comes from.
And remember, when you are being tempted, do not say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death.
So this is, if we're going to believe this, and I do, I think the two of you do, this is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Do not say God is tempting. Where does temptation come from? Verse 14 comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away.
Mm-hmm.
So what James is asking us to do is take responsibility for ourselves and stop blaming God.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we've got to keep the center stage as we work through Genesis 22 about who actually caused Abraham to think he had to sacrifice his son. Are you tracking with me on the importance of what James is saying?
I am. I'm noting James 1:13 to 15, and I'm going to hold on to it.
Okay, we're ready for verse 2 of Genesis 22, verse 2.
Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you.
You know, I'm going to pick up on that very first statement. Take your son, your only son. Now, of course, he had another son. This other son was through Hagar, and his name was Ishmael. So how come the narrative says your only son? So we're going to pick up on it. We can say things like, well, he's the son of promise. But the fact is, in reality, Abram had another son. So what's interesting is that during the slave epoch, in what became the United States of America, the child of a free man and a slave woman was deemed a slave. That was the practice.
Right.
And the precedent probably comes from this verse and also from Galatians chapter 4. So we're going to read that, Galatians 4, 24 to 27.
These two women serve as an illustration of God's two covenants. The first woman, Hagar, represents Mount Sinai, where people received the law that enslaved them. And now Jerusalem is just like Mount Sinai in Arabia because she and her children live in slavery to the law. But the other woman, Sarah, represents the heavenly Jerusalem. She is the free woman, and she is our mother.
Yeah, so what Paul is doing is he's picking up this concept that take your only son, when he has two sons, and he points out that the children of Hagar, who is a servant or a slave, are slaves. And the children of the free woman are free. So this reinforces the concept that is mooted in Genesis 22, verse 2.
I hadn't realized that, that this is probably based on this story in Genesis 22, that was kind of the standard that was set, what was the expectation, and that's continued right into, in a sense, our time with the slavery in the United States. And that's quite amazing.
So, you know, many of the values of the Judeo-Christian culture were taken literally from the Old Testament. I can give you another example, the idea of tithing, 10% of your income. It comes directly out of the Old Testament. There's no admonition to tithe in the New Testament. And that was followed by most religious organizations in the Judeo-Christian ethic.
Yeah. I think my comment out of this would be what I'm feeling when I see the two-time references to, the receiving of the law and that enslaving them. And, the idea of not referencing it as the law, but this idea of how we see the Old Testament, how we understand God in the Old Testament, in my mind, has kept me a slave to seeing God as a master, somebody who is to be obeyed and feared, versus now coming into the New Testament, understanding Jesus coming as the true character of showing the true character of God, bringing this freedom idea, and also seeing all the layers of pain in those two women and how much trauma has been passed down by this concept of slavery, not and in the concept of real slavery, but the slavery of seeing things the way we have always seen them. And had new light not sort of come in, I would still be viewing it that way. And to me, that is just the ultimate sadness to think of how I felt, 4 or 5 years ago, versus now when I can read these things and instead of just being like so discouraged, I'm like, wait a second, I think my lens is not quite seeing in behind the layers. And yeah, anyways, there's a comment.
So I was curious about what Hebrews 11 might say about this incident of God asking Abraham to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering. And so this is what it says in Hebrews 11:19.
It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. Abraham, who had received God's promises, was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had told him, "Isaac is the son through whom your descendants will be counted." Abraham reasoned that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life again. And in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead.
So what's interesting is that the writer of Hebrews, the author, is writing post-Jesus and all Jesus' miracles of resurrection. Up to the point of Abraham in the Old Testament, there'd been no resurrections.
Yeah, so it would have been in the story, which we will get to, where Abram makes the reference that, we're going to go up, but we will come back. And is the assumption that he thought that maybe God would bring him back to life is pretty unlikely, because it had never happened up to that point.
Well, and to compound the point even more, is that the Hebrews believed that when you died, that was the end. They had no concept of afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
That would only come much later.
There's another word here. It uses the word testing. God was testing Abraham. And it's assumed that God was testing him to see if he would obey what he'd been told. But there's another way to understand that testing, that he could have been testing Abraham of his understanding of God and God's character, not whether or not he would obey or not.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, thank you. So, it took me a long time to realize that there are active and passive voices recorded in the Bible. It's not a univocal account. And for instance, in the New Testament, Paul will say in 2 Corinthians 11 that the devil can masquerade as an angel of light. So when you have an angel speaking, you have to check whether that is actually God or Satan speaking. It's not just a record of just God speaking. And so this creates confusion and misunderstanding. In the story of Job, his three friends keep telling him, you're suffering because you did something wrong. Now just confess what you did wrong to God. He'll forgive you and your suffering will be over. Now, is that the voice of God speaking through the friends, or is this voice of the evil one? That wasn't true.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't true. He was not being punished for some misdemeanor on his part.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we need to be careful about, when it says rightly dividing the word of truth. It means that we need to bring to bear on the Bible at least the tools we use when we're reading literature.
Mm-hmm. So,
for instance, who influenced Herod to kill the baby boys in Bethlehem supernaturally? Well, I'm guessing it was the evil one.
Mm-hmm.
So if he could influence Herod to do such a dastardly deed, why can't he influence Abraham to do a similar deed? So this brings us to the question of how do we recognize the voice of God? I've married, officiated at a lot of weddings in my life. I thought it was all over, but I have 2 more this year. And I'm happy for them. I get bored doing funerals. Although I must admit, people are more attentive at funerals than at weddings. So, how does one actually discern the will of God? If you can have this genius of an evil being, supernatural evil being, that can deceive us very easily. So the best answer I ever got to this question came from George Mueller. He was an Englishman famous for establishing orphanages in industrial England. And he never asked anybody for a cent. And yet he established all these orphanages and maintained them with food and so on. And he didn't have the means personally.
Mhm.
So people asked him, they said, so how do you know what to do? And his answer was that he would pray until the outcome didn't matter to him, whether it was yes or no.
Mm.
And that's difficult. Two people come to the pastor and say, we're planning to get married, we'd like you to officiate. And you talk to them and it becomes clear that this marriage is not going to work. But there's no way you can convince those two people.
Mhm.
I don't know, Warren, have you been able to?
Only in one situation.
Yeah? No,
Yeah.
you've done better than I am. Because why? You say to the people, well, go and pray about it. But they're praying that their will be done.
Mhm.
So I like Mueller's solution. Pray until the outcome doesn't matter to you, and then you'll hear God's voice.
Mm.
So Jesus states in John 7:17, if you are willing to do the will of God, you will know if my teaching is true. So what this means is that truth is recognized through purity of motive rather than by analytical inquiry. When Jesus says, by their fruit you will know them, he also means the fruit of the message in our lives will authenticate the message's truthfulness.
Mhm.
Does the message make you more compassionate and less judgmental?
Mhm.
That's the fruit of the message. So what do you think about that? Can you think of teachings that made you less compassionate? Of course, Sasha can't answer this because she's just brimming over with compassion at every turn.
No, but I will say, like the teachings of the Bible, like when I was growing up and the teachings of the Church of the Bible, there was always so much talk somehow about, making sure that everybody is doing the right thing, and you have to talk to the brother if they're sinning, and everybody, it seemed very critical to me growing up. And I always wondered how people had so much time to be in everybody else's business. Because wasn't it just hard enough to live? And that was the way I felt. And I really didn't like the thought that other people had to be worried about if I was doing the right things or the wrong things. And I think later on, there was also this feeling of that you shouldn't let anything else in, just the Bible and all these things. And so like popular psychology or anything like that was sort of like really discouraged in a sense, because it was like, no, this isn't, God's teachings and stuff. And I think the older I got and the more I realized that actually there is so much wisdom in understanding our brains and the way that we are created and made, but that we can't know all that unless it's also being decoded to us, just kind of like how you are, in a sense, helping decode the Bible. I also needed decoding and understanding how my brain works and how trauma has affected my life and all of these things. And slowly but surely, I think what has come out of that is deep compassion, not just for other people, but now this phase of life is learning about deep compassion for myself, which I think is a journey to healing that I'm only just scraping at. But I think that when we are in this place of outward, with how sort of oftentimes the Bible is done, I think that it becomes harsh and critical if we don't have the understanding and safety of God and the view of God that now gives me peace and joy. So, yeah, I think the fruit really does come to play when we start finding safety and love in God.
The other example that comes to my mind is the church's use of the clobber text to delegate the homosexual community to a second-class citizen,
Yeah.
and exclusion from the church and from leadership. And so the result has been that, the suicide rate is much higher among those young people than the average.
Yeah.
And so it's saying, the fruit of that teaching has not worked out well.
Right. Yeah, good point.
You both raise good examples of the negative effects of certain theologies.
Mhm.
And I think using Jesus' test, by their fruit you will know them, on these teachings, it's clear that they don't line up with Jesus' theology.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, one has to ask, what do the Hebrews, the Jews, do with this story? So I referenced the chief rabbi of Britain, Rabbi Sachs, and I read quite a bit of what he said, because he's an authentic voice in terms of Judaism. And he quotes, and there's a quote here about the Christian theologian. One of you read that, please.
The Christian theologian Soren Kierkegaard wrote a powerful book about it, Abraham sacrificing Isaac, called Fear and Trembling, in which he coined such ideas as the teleological suspension of the ethical. The love of God may lead us to do things that would otherwise be considered morally wrong, and faith in the absurd. Abraham trusted God to make the impossible possible. He believed that he would lose Isaac, but still keep him. For Kierkegaard, faith transcends reason.
Thank you. So that's Kierkegaard's solution to this story, that faith transcends reason. So it seems to me that that kind of solution offers up the door to all kinds of mischief and fanaticism that's been used down through the centuries. You say this is obvious nonsense, but somehow your faith makes it believable.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't go that way. And I don't expect anybody to go that way, because you have these people who drown their children in a bath of water, and they tell you, well, God, I heard God's voice and he told me to. Nobody believes that in real life. We take those people to court, and we try them.
But something in that story, though, because I'm just being reminded, as I was growing up, I think a central message that was trying to be translated in this story was that you shouldn't ever love anything more than God, and that Isaac was obviously so waited for. He was so loved. And so this was God's test to say, well, do you love me the most, or will you hold back your son? And ultimately, the idea was that if you could kill your own child, it would prove to God that no, God was the ultimate true love of your life. And it led so much also into the Ten Commandments beliefs that you should have no one else before you except for God, and that this was somehow going to prove that, you know, you were ultimately free from anything that was before God. And this always really scared me, because I thought, you know, what if I wasn't able to give up my children if God wanted it, or whatever, you know? And I feel like it created a really harmful understanding that God would even want that he would even ask that.
Well, it's interesting that you, within the commandments, you have this struggle. Like, you know, are you going to obey God, or are you going to kill? And he says not to kill.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's like
I
the
know. So much.
issues within this story become very complicated.
Yeah.
So one of the impactful suggestions that I've heard is that if Abraham believed that this was somebody else's voice, he would have protested it. But because he didn't protest it, it must have been God's voice.
But he had no problem protesting God. I mean, he challenged God about Sodom and Gomorrah.
Good.
So I don't think that flows for me.
So I listed all the times that I know of that Abraham protested. The first one is in chapter 15 of Genesis. He protests to God that Eliezer can be his heir because he has no children. So he is not shy to protest. And then when God says, no, you're going to have a son, he says, well, and you're going to protest the land, he wants evidence of that. So God takes him out, shows him the stars and the sand, and says they'll be like that. In chapter 17, he laughs when God says he and Sarai are going to have a son, and recommends that God accept Ishmael as the promised son. In chapter 18, he bargains with God for the survival of Sodom. I mean, that's a whole detailed negotiation of protest on Abraham's part. In chapter 20, Abraham protests God's infertility on Abimelech's woman. And he says, that's not fair. You've got to do something about that. And then in chapter 21, Abraham has serious negotiations of protest with Abimelech in connection with water rights. So he's clearly a skilled negotiator and protester, an activist, if you like, and not afraid to confront God himself. Hundreds of years later, Moses negotiated with God at the burning bush and at Sinai. And David has all these protest psalms. Jonah has complaints, and Habakkuk's outcry against injustice by God indicate that this was part of the Israelite tradition to engage in serious dialogue with God. However, in this incident, Abram does not protest the sacrificing of Isaac with the Lord. This seems to indicate that the voice that called him to sacrifice his son, came from within himself, as James describes it. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away.
Okay, so now that's quite a departure from the traditional view that this is a temptation that comes from within Abraham himself.
Yeah. Well, we have to do something with what James says.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm wondering if we should pause there. before we go into the next section?
Yes, I think we're making that decision on the basis of exhaustion.
Of our exhaustion, or we're expecting that our listeners are exhausted by now?
Yes. So let's pray together. Dear God, we're so full of ourselves, or at least I am. And I really think arrogantly that I can discover all this interesting information and be right. But at least in a sober moment like this, I pray for the three of us, myself specifically, that we'll be willing to do your will so that we might discern the truth in your word. Thank you for your promise that if we come to you, you will always respond to us. You're wonderful. We worship you. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Find the recording of our podcast on our website, as well as the PDF document that we've been using, so you can follow along or at least see all the passages. And so that website is rediscoveringgod.ca, and on there is the PDF document, the link for the podcast, as well as our YouTube link. We are now on YouTube. So if you want to see us live, then you can go and watch it on YouTube.
Wonderful. And we'd also love to invite you to our Monday evening Zoom discussion where Ian and Warren lead us out. And we are currently going through the podcast where we get to have discussion and really dive in a little deeper and get our most pressing questions answered. It's a really wonderful time of fellowship and connection with the group. We share in community and resources as well. We'd really love to have you join us. We're going to be meeting at 6:30 Mountain Standard Time. You just add in the link 403-506-9201. We'd love to see you.
And if you'd like to connect with us, you can reach us at rediscoveringgod2020@gmail.com. Send us an email. We'd love to hear from you and know how this journey of rediscovering the God that Jesus knew is changing your life. Take care.